So first, I always start with this. It's just an OK ball, I call it. So it fits my hand, and it should fit most others' hands, so you can have it. So whenever you're in need, and you're just like, it's going to be OK.
Do I?
So,
I don't have to pass it around?
no, that you can. That's yours. So I like. I have many OK balls around my studio when you need a sense of like, it's going to be fine.
I have no idea how much
Well, so other than that, I'll show you some of the process that I work through. It's not super riveting in that way because it's really a slow process. So I actually made these objects here and that piece at Cranbrook and drove them up here because a lot of my time is spent just doing this. You know, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out when I can move to the next stage. So depending on the weather, depending on the studio environment, I build chambers to, like drawing chambers to slow them down or to speed them up and try to get them to be as consistent as possible. So I push them pretty far to the end of leather hard just so I can work with them and they'll stay a little bit truer for me. So, I wait until it's pretty hard to try to start working on them. One other thing that I've done is I've started working with like a attachment slip that is essentially made up like a casting slip from my same clay. So I dry the clay that I use out to bone dry, then I pulverize it, and then I make a slip that has very little water in it, and it's mostly Darvan or some sort of sodium silicate or something in there. And that, I do that because I found with the larger pieces, obviously warping and things happen a lot when water is moving out. So if you're like me, you've had the moments where you make a piece at the end of the day and you leave and you're like, I did it, I'm a genius. And then you come back in the morning and it's like this, and that's because the water is escaping. So one thing that I found that with a attachment slip that has way less water, there's way less shrinking, way less cracking and all that. So I don't know if that's an insight or not, but it's really worked for me. I don't, like I mentioned today in my talk that I don't really have a specific type of clay that I use. I use probably like 5 to 6 different clays. So this is a clay that they had here that I've been using, and it seems pretty good. But then I also, this is Laguna's 850. This is a very standard stoneware. So this is this is a finished piece, kind of an example from my studio that you can see. And then this is which would be kind of on the smaller scale. And then now, in my studio, I'm making pieces that this object and this object are somewhere in this range and getting even further, slightly further out to that. So that's really been a game changer for me in terms of how to manage those pieces as they get to that scale. And these, at this scale, they're not thrown. They're slabbed and then they're built at the wheel, coil building at the wheel in a very traditional way in order to accomplish that. Whereas these are just thrown, these parts are all just thrown at the wheel as normal. I don't use a ton of fancy tools. I use all the same tools that most of you use. I use like a bread cutter. This was a really nice find for me. It's even got a ruler on it, which is very satisfying. I use a couple of different types of ribs in terms of, I like the flexible ones. This one's a stainless, very hard one that I quite like. I always use snap-off blades that I take out of the snap-off blade and use it as a tool to shape with and to cut with. I do a lot of the cutting with X-Acto knives to get really nice sharp cuts. What else? I also use bandsaw blades. It's similar to like shaping surfboards, so you can shape larger swaths of space. And sometimes I'll take that bandsaw blade and actually attach it to a piece of wood to keep it straight again, and you could use that as a shaping tool. So I make a certain amount of tools to get the job done that I need. And one thing I spend a lot of time doing is trying to figure out when I have to get rid of these tools, which I just thrash. I just go through tons of them. So I want to make sure that they're flat, and as soon as they go to a little bow, they go to a new place. Or I cut them up or use them in some other way. So with that, what else? I'm done. Okay. So I have these pieces that I made yesterday, so they're just way too wet. So these pieces are now, I would say, at a pretty good stage to start making some work from. So I mentioned, I think in my talk this morning too, that I do all of my trimming standing, and I would say I probably do it even taller. My wheel's probably somewhere up in here, so it gets a little awkward, but I prefer to be up. And part of that is because I do want to experience things more in profile. I found that over time, when I wanted to see an object in profile, I was getting onto the ground all the time and doing all that, and I just was getting old. And so I didn't like doing that anymore, so I don't. So this would be, an object that I had thrown. Obviously, I'd be throwing it just like a standard, low, shallow object. And then when it's ready, I know I'm going to be flipping it over. I might use some other bigger rib tool to start. Can't tell if it's on. And then I like to get some final compression to the bottom, which will help keep things a little bit flatter. And Seth made fun of me yesterday for talking about S-cracks. I know the S-crack is the dreaded S-crack, but I saw something on YouTube the other day, and it was really wonderful. And he talked about moving the energy back to the center, because we're so busy pulling the energy out that if you can just spend a little time giving some energy back to the center of the object, you'll have less S-cracks. So far, it's worked. Not entirely. I don't know how much weird techie stuff you want to really hear, but I'm working on a plastic bat here, which I never would do. Never. I impugn plastic bats. But I love the Wonder Bat. It's really cool. It actually works for me because it doesn't have a pin that goes through all the way to the top, so you get a full flat surface. I spend a lot of time soaking my bats at the end of the day and then clamping them and putting them under pressure to keep them as flat as possible because they warp really fast. So every day I have like big weights that I keep on there to keep them as true as possible. What else? You can feel free to ask any questions or if you have any thoughts or along the way. So at this point, I might be thinking about some form of measurement. If I knew that, in this case, this is like a double-walled object which has the steam vents out of it. If I was going to do that or not, I'm not sure, but that keeps rolling off there. But I might, if I wanted to use this object straight down here, I might, stack this thing on top for a second and center it up there. Find my needle tool again. And give myself a basic tracing measurement of where it might fall. So in that case, I know that that's about how big that is, so I would probably want to cut it inward a little bit. So I just simply cut this innard out. So I would have this object now. And then I would take this, and this could become something else, something later. So I mentioned this a lot. I talk about this a lot. This is going to be something, I trust. So in all these cases now that I have some strength here, I can move this over here for you maybe a little bit. I can use this as some sort of guide too. So as I mentioned before, I could drop this over the top. Now I've got a fairly close measurement, and I would be wanting to experience this in sort of profile. So for me, that seems like clumsy. I'd want it to be lower maybe or something. So I could very easily take this object. I do a lot of this flipping over back and forth. Give myself a basic tracing line, and then I'm back again. Sometimes you want to anchor it down a little bit, but I think I'll be okay. And now I have this thing, which I like. That'll be something. So sometimes I might do something where I would have this object sit within here. It might be floating very gently, very barely over the surface. That's cool. And I could use this again going through. And so I could start to stack. So I might make a cylinder that I just am actually taking rings out of and then stacking and stacking and stacking. And that way I know I have a similar measurement. I haven't been using the top in the same way recently because I want this very flat shoulder. So in some cases, you know, I could do any number of things. So if I had this object here, I might just, you know, have some fun. And I don't know what I would do with these things. Sometimes I have a clearer picture, and sometimes I don't. I don't know, a fin. But maybe I want to start, I sometimes will spend time just playing around with objects like that and thinking, well, that could do something, or maybe I don't like that. It's kind of clumsy too. And I might do something like this, and then I might say, well, gosh, in the end, I could have one. I like things kind of off-center, but this could be a sight. So I don't know what that would be like. This was from yesterday, you know, and it's like, well, that could be something eventually or something like that. So I do spend a lot of time just kind of shuffling things around and seeing what feels right. Sometimes it's just like, that's a terrible idea, Ian, and we kind of move on to something else, and maybe I could save these things as some other type of object that may exist in some form later. Or these are these extruded pieces over here that I extruded yesterday. I mess around with the dies quite a bit, you know, and try to, instead of having just a square and a square, I'll put a circle and a square or a different shape in there. They become hard to dry because you have different thicknesses. But these could exist. I did a couple of pieces like this where these ended up being somehow on top of here in that way. Scale's a little off with these. Or I could take this. I really like, I feel like I have a 5-year-old daughter. I feel like I'm a 5-year-old who just loves to cut paper, you know, just like cut stuff. I feel like I'm just basically just want to cut stuff, you know, all the time. It's very satisfying to just cut things. But, so I could have any number of things around at any time to use. Sometimes I take, you saw maybe at the talk that you would have things like steel inserts and things like that. Oftentimes I would make a piece that's fully round, and I would cut a ring out just as I did like just with this piece, and then I would reset these things back on. I would actually be slipping them back into place with a gap, and I would do something like keep sometimes something even like this. I have some objects in my studio or pieces of steel that are just slightly bigger than the gauge of steel that I might want, and I would use that as a guide and let that dry in there as long as possible before I would finally, you know, relieve that out of there, and then hopefully I'll get a little bit of a space that can hold for my steel components later, something like that. So, where am I? What am I doing? So because of this, I mentioned that I handle the object so much. Oftentimes I pancake them back and forth with bats, so I'm actually not handling it. I mean, I'm like really handling this thing quite a bit. But part of that, that's another reason why I wait till a pretty hard, leather hard stage to be able to do that. Because once it goes, you know, clay has kind of has a memory. You know, it's when something warps and you're like, oh, I can just fix it, and you try to put it back in, it usually goes back to it during the firing. So I try to not handle them as much as possible and move on. So I might have 6 or 7 of these going at one time. Sometimes it can become a little maddening, but I still feel that it allows me to kind of move through things and not get hung up on certain ones. And I don't carry. I still fall in love with certain pieces and want them to work, but I have that less and less if I have the numbers around. So I would do the same probably with this piece here. Get myself a basic trace. Yeah, so now at Cranbrook we have all they're all Blau kilns. They're the sort of kilns from Holland. So mostly gas, almost, not always now. Just starting to play around with firing to cone 1 to a much lower temperature for the bigger pieces. Very dry surfaces. I'm super nervous about it because I can't even touch them basically because they just get dirty. So I'm just getting deeper and deeper into fussy surfaces, but almost always in reduction. Cone 10, these are. That's probably, well, I set that up. I mean, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, glaze loves a rounded edge because it can hold it, but it doesn't like a sharp edge and it'll pull. So I try to create some places where that'll pull, but oftentimes there is probably 3 glazes in there. So if you'll see like a blue surface and then maybe a black behind it, and as it pulls, it reveals the black glaze a little bit more. So I'm trying to set up as many scenarios as possible for that to happen. It's a very small amount of water. I'd have to look at the recipe to remember it, but I would say it's really, it's a very small amount. And I always, you know, make the same jokes over and over. But you know, if the building was on, studio was on fire, what would you grab? I would grab the immersion blender, you know, as like the best tool, you know. For glazing, but I also immersion blend the slip, so it's quite, you know, viscous in that way. But yeah, very little water. So now I have another thing. So at this point now I might start thinking about attaching things. I usually try to address all of these things first as much as possible. So I don't have to do a lot of trimming after I've sort of set up or I'm ready to attach something. So the reason I go through these so much is I would say I probably do 80% of the trimming with this. I don't do as much trimming with the trimming tools as I do with these tools here. But I can do some trimming. Yeah. Bizarre having you there. No. So in this case, like I said, I do a lot of trimming with this as it goes. So. I find these to be much better to trim with for a lot of reasons. One is they're just sharp as could be. So, and as you all know, if you cut your fingers a lot, so if they're in the bottom of your bucket sort of thing, but be careful with that. Trim the inner a little bit. So now I have a fairly cleaned up top, and I would address more of the other things later as I've assembled some things. So back to here again. And then I would find this sort of centering here. I basically just want this inner one, for whatever, as a kind of a design reason, I just want it to just sort of peek out from underneath there. I don't want it to be too far back or sunk below this level here. And that's just really an aesthetic design decision. I just think it looks a little, I like it to be floating, but I want some sort of sense of levels to it, if that makes any sense at all. It might just be a personal thing. So one thing I was talking about during my talk this morning was that now, as I'm getting bigger, these pieces won't really be assembled until post-firing. So I'll carry them all the way through glazing and everything. And in some cases, I'm finding that as I get through, I pulled out a pretty big ring out of the kiln the other day, and I just thought to myself, like, maybe this is enough, you know? So I'm always kind of playing around with, like, what's enough? What's enough to be minimal but not be dismissive in a way, to just be like, what? It's nothing, but it's a kind of a fine line for me too. So this is a new thought for me, to not attach them all as opposed to attaching them.
Are your pieces balancing on each other, or do you use some type of adhesive after firing to keep them together? Are you using like a resin?
Oh, I'm just using like an epoxy or something like that. And this is a new venture for me. For the most part, I like the idea that they get assembled at leather hard, then they get unified through firing, and they get glazed together, and it becomes like this hard thing. So I like the idea that it feels like it's kind of hewn from one solid chunk in a way. So it's kind of moving out of that sense, but I'm just kind of I'm giving it a shot as a different way of thinking about it.
Is it because of technical reasons that you're not firing?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, I'm going to, it's just at that scale, at cone 10, it's just so, that kind of low, long overhang or pitch, it's a lot of weight. And especially if I start to add, you know, I might extrude, I was showing you earlier, sort of different shapes that are being attached to the outside, and it's only being attached to like half of it or something. You just get this awkward drying and thicket spots, and so the bigger it just gets more and more difficult to figure that out. So part technical, part conceptual sort of thing. What was I doing? Oh yeah. So this is my attachment slip, and you don't really have to, I don't think you don't really have to score it. I just get paranoid, and it's because I was taught to do it that way a long time ago that I do, but you don't have to. The squeeze bottle is fun too. You're into that sort of thing. This one that I made here, it's a little bit runnier than I normally would have. You can, because I want it to be actually like really pasty, because in some cases I'm attaching things vertical to a vertical surface, and so if I'm putting it on, it just goes, you know. So, but when I get it just right, which is the exact right recipe, I can put that slip on, and it'll just hold there, you know. And so I can put it on both sides and really, because it's got such little water in it that it's already drying quite a bit. And sometimes I have to kind of act fast because it'll dry so quickly. So, and then I just apply a good amount of pressure all the way around it. And then if you are really feeling paranoid, concerned, I would roll out a very small coil, which is essentially this is like a weld, an idea of welding with clay. And I would attach this all the way around. So, creaky wheel. So in that case, that's really this part, right? So you can see, I mean, I I could go back in and fully address this if I was really concerned about it and blend it in if I wanted, or I could not. But I might go back at this point and try to pay a little bit of attention to this part here. So at this point, I would have to make some decisions whether or not I like this slight little overhang or whether or not I want it to be sort of like right up on the object. I don't like the way that looks now, so I would maybe cut this back a little bit somehow with a trimming tool or with another rib. So there is a lot of trimming, and I find that when I think about the wheel now, I don't really think about it as, even though I come from a pottery background, I tend to really think about it just as a device that's spinning. You know, it's just like a thing that moves. It's a little bit more like a lathe. I could also at this point kind of attend to the side, which is another reason that I want to have a nice sharp tool that's maintaining that sort of 90-degree angle. Okay. As I mentioned, I spent a lot of time trimming, so there is a phase where I just have to stop. Even when you add an attachment slip that's minor in terms of its water content, it does start to feel to me like it's starting to get moist again because I'm sponging in and stuff. So I might go back and set that down while I would move back to, I'd go back to maybe to this piece, which could be the final, maybe the final component of the bottom of this one. Some people have asked, like, if I'm going to use, for instance, this tall piece. Well, in reality, that might be the bottom of the foot. That's it. But I still want to make something that's going to be, a foot or 2 feet tall, because I might use this object in some fashion. So, I could have this object become a piece that I use as a strange object of some sort. So keeping all the pieces around. That's part of the reason I say there is this kind of numbers game, that you're just, rather than falling in love with any piece, I just kind of try to move through it kind of in a way. I mean, when I started working as like apprentices to potters, that was something they would talk about. There's probably like a 10% failure rate from either when you're making it or when you're glazing it or when you fire it, and so you just kind of try to plan that in. I have periods of time where I lose more. Sometimes sometimes they might not be lost, but I look at them and I just think there's something odd, like it's not sitting right or something. So I'm like, that's out, So I keep it for some other thing at some other point. So I don't know what the percentage is. Early on, the early sort of phases of them can be dramatic. Like the big ones that I've been working on, those I lost a lot of at the beginning, and still am trying to figure out how to manage what I want at that scale. So, what's your loss? So at this point, then I start doing the looking game, which has to do trying to figure out if I like it. So it's like, it's okay. I would like it to be lower, so lower. Votes for lower? Okay. Never mind. No. Okay. No. Whoa, that's fast. Now I have this thing. So, at this point, I could, and I would attach those things on there, that bottom foot on there, let it set up some more, continue to maybe work the interior a little bit more, and for it to shape up before I would be finished with it. Then, oftentimes, I'd flip it upside down, obviously, so I can fire it face upside down to keep this as flat as possible, and then glaze fire it right side up as normal and carry on. Sometimes, as I mentioned, I might then take objects like this, fully work these down just as like it was the most important part of my day, and then maybe somehow it exists like that. So it's just a lot of time. Some days I feel like I'm just like managing all of these small parts. So I kind of create the bigger forms first, and then I have all these other parts around that I spend a lot of time sort of managing. But yeah, I kind of like the long form. I'm one of those long form podcast people. So long interviews, things that can go on for a long time without me having to change them over all the time. Otherwise, it's longer. Some music, but almost never silent. But I do like some sort of talking in the background, so I can learn something. The trimmings? Oh, I'll definitely be like, look at that, and definitely this could be something, I almost never use it because it's like it's like goes against every part of my body or something. But I definitely save trimmings. I save things that, and oftentimes I don't use them, but I save, as you're extruding and something comes out of the side, I'll be like, wow, I'll save everything for a certain amount of time. Some just don't make it. Some last a day, some go for a year, but I try to respond in the moment. I think part of it has to do with, ceramics in so many ways is methodical. The process is kind of epic, it takes a long time. So within this part, it's a time for me to be far more spontaneous, and there's a certain type of expediency that I like with the material, and then I can let it set up and I can have more control or something, but it's a way to find some spontaneity in it. And I think that's probably why I still fire to the higher temperatures too. I mean, I have played around like so many people thinking, that the Cone 5 and 6 was going to be it's going to save us all. And I think it does in some ways, but I still have yet to find the surfaces that I like for some reason. And I think it might have something to do with the fusion of the clay and glaze at that temperature where it feels harder that I just respond to. Yeah, I always make the work and ship. I've never really spent time, over there making work. I would like to, but time being what it is, hard to do. Oh, I should actually cut this. So I could do something with this eventually. Parts and parts, parts. Any other questions? I don't know, I'm kind of, feel like I'm rambling on and just moving stuff around here.
I have a question. So your work has such a reassemble?
Maybe, yeah, I mean, I've thought about, the idea of having flexibility, I think, is interesting. I don't know why, but I don't really like the idea of being non-committal.
Yeah. Right.
So there's something like there's a strange, there's a strange line there for me where it's like, yeah, do what you want with it. Seems terrifying to me, but at the same time, I like the idea that there might be some sort of flexibility in it, which is what I was just talking about before, where there might be a time where they don't all come together. I think this is kind of fine as it is, but I tend to find myself oftentimes looking at this particular form and thinking that I like this, and so I'm like, I don't know how to deal with that yet, but I don't always want to make it into something. And in some cases, it could actually exist. I've done pieces where it exists this way, so it can be completely in another orientation. It doesn't have to. There's no limit in that way to what you could do with it. Yeah, we were just talking about that in the hallway a little bit, but sometimes there's a lot of control, and sometimes the unit is made first, and then the objects come second, and I can play around with it, but sometimes they're very methodical. But I find that, when and the reason I felt like I started to get away from making those kind of installations that were the larger ones at the very beginning, because I just felt like it was a lot of A equals B, this is C, this is supposed to mean this, and I just found it to be, just getting tiring for me. I was just like, I was in service to my ideas, and I wasn't finding anything new out of that moment. There wasn't a lot of no surprise. There wasn't a lot of discovery. You would take it out and you'd be like, there it is. That's what I wanted. And yeah. So even though I wish, in the what we need in our lives, our hierarchy of needs or something, but you want things to work out. At the same time, this has been kind of my more recent solution to work quicker and respond and try to have a little bit of fun through it. So this is like a compass. So these forms, I wait pretty far for these when I'm making the extruded pieces. I push these to a pretty far space of leather hard in order for them to keep their shape. This one's not quite there yet. It sort of like wants to bend a little bit, but it's pretty close. So what I do is I definitely work on sheetrock like this, or I work on hardy backer or the cement board, and I would also do the same thing that I do with the thrown objects. Is I'd be extruding many of them across, and then I would take a second one, put it under weight, and then dry them like that. So I might have a stack that's very high to keep them under weight. And then in some cases, depending on the scale of extrusion, I've made miter boxes for each extrusion size. And so I know that I can just basically drop down and get 30 degrees, 45 degrees, or whatever I'm after. And then I would wait, and I would start to assemble these pieces in the way, in a very straightforward way. And I found the same thing applies with these. The less water and the less drying, the better. So obviously, when you get to something like this and this length, it gets very complicated for it not to want to, especially at cone 10. Cone 10 is everything just wants to move around. So I fire also under weight. I would I would take a kiln shelf and just drop the kiln shelf right on top of the object and fire it and see if that would work to keep it from moving. It still tends to want to flex in certain ways, but I've had better success over time with that. So yeah, that's this part. And one thing I do also is, these are the different clays, but I would, definitely have now also made pieces where the thrown parts come into play with all of these. I could take extruded parts and put them with the thrown parts. For me, it's just like another language. And so you can see when it gets to a leather hard, it's like very satisfying to cut, put together. So I could have something like that, and then maybe I could use, I kind of liked that idea. Something like this. I don't know what I'm doing. So it's just a construction of forms. A lot of it is still based on pottery forms. The extruded forms that I've been making recently, I might have something like this, and once again, I could have this object here, and I could do the same thing that I mentioned before, which is to have a spacer that I've created, and then I could attach those two objects, and then maybe I would have I had a couple pieces in my most recent show that had a steel component that came out of that, and then there was a sight there. There was a new sight, like a tray sight. So for me, this would be it was basically thinking about design, thinking through design as a form of sculpture. So I mentioned in my work also, coming from a production pottery early background, I still think that I apply the ethics of that way of working towards making sculpture. So an economy of form and an economy of ideas. So I like the idea of not wasting anything. I did an entire exhibition one time of many different not colored clays, but just like a terracotta color to a white clay, and then recycling those two things together all the way down to where, and not glazing, to where you would basically go from a red all the way back to a very beige by recycling every scrap and using every scrap to make a piece. There was it's a method of recycling, but also for me a conceptual point of view in terms of, again, the frame of the idea is to not waste anything. That's the brief, and then for me I move into making work from there. So at this point, I don't know if you have other questions. I can keep chatting, or you can come up and you can look at these closer if you want, maybe, because we have a little bit more time, another 10 minutes, but we could look at things closer if you want to, or if you have questions, or I can answer questions. I was that lucid. I do think about that. I mean, I think that oftentimes people kind of reference this to be sort of like, somehow a brutalist sort of architectural, game or something because of the sort of common shape or something. But yeah, I mean, I think about architecture and design in a certain way too, almost to the point of like, table heights. All the chairs, all these chairs are like based on average American heights and things like that. So there is something in there that's interesting to think about. Again, that's why the chair is kind of it's something that we see a lot of. And the cup for ceramics is one of the interesting things too, because it's a small frame, it's a small idea. I mean, Ron Nagel has based decades of work around the cup, and so there's this sort of frame to work within. So architecture and the forms of architecture and the spaces are interesting to me. I don't have training in that or anything, so I just kind of I respond to spaces and in forms in the same way. But architecture, yes, for sure. Furniture, obviously. Things that are design, functional design, things that I like the idea too with these early on pieces. I used to talk a lot about the idea that there's a difference between referencing something and actually doing the real thing. So we spend a lot of time, saying I want it to be like this, I want it to be like that. And I started thinking, well, I just want it to be that thing. So if it is that, then that carries a reference with it as well. So thinking about architecture and design and things like that, that's where I started going towards design, was because I didn't want to simply reference the thing. I thought it would be interesting to also be involved in the methodology of making that way.
So why clay instead of
Terrible question. No, well, that's that.
Coming
Yeah,
from
yeah.
someone who used to work in wood and now works in clay.
No, that's totally that's a total valid question. I think, you know, for me, that's another reason why I think I've always wanted to work at that particular temperature, and why I don't cast. Seth and I were talking about this. Everything is still thrown by hand, so they have a sense of being precise, but there's also experiencing them in life, maybe not experiencing them through the image. And through the image, sometimes maybe they do seem a little tight, but experiencing them in life, for me, I mean, I spend a lot of time right up on them. And so I sense a certain type of warmth in the surface, and I sense a certain type of something being made by hand in the surface. So I'm thinking of qualities. And so ceramics has that, that I don't, when I've done, at the talk this morning, I started doing some powder coating and things like that. And it's also a really beautiful surface, but it's a plasticky surface in a sense, because it's a powder that gets melted and it's uniform. So I like that surface in combination with another surface. So I'm trying to think about, why would I use steel? What can I do with steel that I can't do with ceramic? And what can I do with ceramic that I can't really do with steel? I did have a piece like right around this scale. I did a project with a designer in LA where we were taking some of these forms and casting them in glass, solid glass almost, just enough to fit a bulb inside. And so it looked like you were looking into like a solid chunk of ice almost. And so I had a solid aluminum piece milled that looked very similar to this. And it's kind of like cool, but it doesn't really have the same sort of surface. It looks like what it, you know, something, yes, it's cold, but it's like, it's a cool thing. But it was more interesting when it was cast in glass, and then the shattering, cracking from the thickness of the glass came through, and it was sort of counterbalancing against that precision, you know. And in ceramics, the more we work, people want to try to get tighter in that way. And so I'm kind of always, I like that back and forth of the surface and the material, so yeah, if that answers the question. I want it to have a ceramic quality, you know. I take the sort of ceramic nature of it pretty seriously, and I want it to feel as though it is that thing. Oftentimes people will say, it looks like it's metal, and it is, because it has just a skin of a metallic oxide glaze on it. So in a sense, we've made it out of a stony material, but we're applying a metallic oxide to it in the glaze form, so iron, things like that.
Can you powder coat this square?
No, because it doesn't have any water in it, so it doesn't hold an electric charge.
Okay.
So powder coating has to have an be electric some way, hold a charge. So it's got to have, you potentially could powder coat a leather hard piece.
Oh, and a leather hard piece. Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know what that would do. It'd be a very, very soft object. It'd be the most fragile object ever. But yeah, it needs to be, so mostly metal. Yeah. I've heard some people toying around with doing it like on MDF and things like that to get an incredible flat surface, but I don't know how they do that.
Automotive surface.
Yeah, it really is an automotive surface, yeah. I mean, it's an industrial, I started doing it by myself with like a little easy bake oven on smaller things, because you only have to go to like 400 degrees, but
Yeah.
mostly it's an industrial process where they're doing large parts and stuff like that, yeah.
I had it easy bake oven.
Yeah,
A
it worked.
real one.
Yeah, yeah, it's a perfect size for small steel objects. Uh-huh. I don't know. I mean, I definitely, there's just a certain quality to it that I'm satisfied with. I'm definitely not against having a piece, showing a piece, it comes back to the studio, and then I'll change it again for whatever reason. So I've done that a few times, just for whatever reason. But most of the time, that's pretty rare. I tend to, again, because of the numbers and because of, and I'm not producing thousands of pieces or anything, but because there's a number game involved, I decide they're done, and I just kind of move on. and I kind of then try to learn from that, you know. And sometimes I do lose a piece that I quite like, and I'll remake it, you know, like that made a lot of sense to me in the group, if I'm putting together an exhibition. You know, I've had moments where I think like that's the central focus of the show. This is kind of where it's being born, and so I want to actually focus on that object a little bit more. But as far as them being done, I try not to get too hung up on. I don't get too hung up on it really. And sometimes I can't. You can't make up your mind, and I just let them. I let those things go, and they just dry, and I'm like, and I don't fire them, and I slake them down, and if I'm not convinced by it in some way.
They're the students who came from Cranbrook.
Oh, new students. Cool. Okay. See you back there. I'll tell. Yeah. Yeah. So. Yeah, I have. I'm out at Cranbrook now, and I have an exhibition that's opening at the Cranbrook Art Museum in January. So if you're within striking distance of Cranbrook, you should come out and see that exhibition. Also, Annabeth Rosen's exhibition is traveling from Houston, and it's going to open in November. So she's an alum from the Cranbrook Ceramics Department. So the museum will be kind of Cranbrook ceramic centric there for a couple of months. So you can come out and see what we're doing out there and visit.